Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and this lecture is about fiscal policy and public finance. So let's just keep in mind, okay, the goal of Keynesian fiscal policy is to stabilize the economy, to smooth out the business cycle, and to moderate inequality. All right, so let's say that this graph here represents, we have here GDP growth over time. Let's say that this curve here represents the business cycle. All right, so notice we have this, peaks right here, right, and we have troughs, and the troughs indicate recessions, and the peaks indicate expansions. Okay, so what should the government do? How should fiscal policy be conducted here to smooth out this business cycle? Well, when we have recessions, we need to use expansionary fiscal policy. All right, that is fiscal stimulus. And when we have expansions, we can use contractionary fiscal policy. All right. More on these terms later. We'll define expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy very carefully. Okay, so in this way, if we do this successfully, we have the proper timing and the right amount of each of these policies, we can produce a smoother version of the business cycle. Okay, look at this. This is still a cycle. Okay, we still have downturn, we still have expansion and contraction, but the point is we've gone from a more volatile version of this to a much less volatile version. As Keynes says, the outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment. That's one problem, right? And its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes on the other hand. That is from Keynes' General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. That's from Chapter 4, concluding notes on the social philosophy towards which the general theory might lead. So far we've discussed two elements of fiscal policy. All right. These are changing government spending, delta G, and number two, tax cuts. Okay, that's delta DI, a change in disposable income. To go further, we need to define some more terms. So let's talk about government revenue and expenditure. All right, we will call R total government revenue, and E is total government expenditure. And let's just take note here, E includes G, that's government spending on all new goods and services, and also transfer payments. Okay, let's say a little bit more about this, all right? Transfer payments are a large portion of government spending. What they do is they transfer money from the overall tax base towards certain groups. All right, so examples include Social Security, disability benefits, veterans benefits, and unemployment compensation. These are funds which certain groups receive, and that comes from the rest of the taxpayers. All right, so we're now in a position to define budget, deficit, and surplus. Okay, so when we have a situation where the revenue is greater than expenditure, then we have a budget surplus, right? When the revenue is less than the expenditure, we have a budget deficit. And of course, when they're equal, we have a balanced budget. Okay, so we're going to refer to these terms. I might not say budget surplus every time. I might just say surplus or deficit, but this is what I mean. Okay, so the difference between revenue and expenditure. All right, let's just take a look at these things in a little more detail. So here we have a pie chart of U.S. federal government revenue in 2019. Now this is just the federal level. It doesn't include state or local, just the federal. But where does the money come from? What we can see here is the largest single source of revenue is individual income taxes, right? That's 49% of government revenue. So the second largest portion here is the one I've labeled social insurance and retirement. This is the Social Security taxes, the FICA, right? You might see that on your paycheck, the Medicare. This comes out of your paycheck and goes towards funding Social Security and Medicare. Okay, so this is what it's called social insurance and retirement. This is 36% of government revenue. Notice that corporate income taxes are only 6%. That's a very small portion of where the government gets its revenue. Most of it comes from individuals, okay? And then we have another small portion, which is excise taxes, estate taxes, interest, and other assorted taxes, 8%, okay? And this adds up to a total of about 3.4 trillion or $3,422 billion, okay? This is from the Congressional Budget Office. Now let's take a look at some of the spending, okay, the categories of spending, U.S. federal government spending again in 2019. One of the big categories here is healthcare, right? And this is Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, these programs, okay? Again, a lot of these are funded out of the payroll taxes, but not all of it. Right, another big expense here, Social Security. Again, that's funded out of Social Security taxes. Another big expense. These are all, by the way, these red ones are all considered non-discretionary, okay? Meaning that given the laws that are on the books, given the commitments the government has already made, they don't have much choice here, right? They have to pay for all these things, okay? That's what we mean by non-discretionary. And again, these are the categories that are used by the Congressional Budget Office. Okay, so 8% of the budget here is net interest. We have 6%, which is called income security. This basically goes toward the various welfare programs, aid to the families with dependent children, housing, and so forth, okay? Other programs, 4%. We have federal, civilian, and military retirement, veterans programs. Okay, then we have a big share of the discretionary part, which goes to national defense. Now, believe it or not, this is actually not even all of the spending that goes towards what we might call warfare. But this is the portion which goes to the Department of Defense. Okay, and then we have another portion of spending here, which is considered non-defense discretionary spending. Okay, and just as a side note, some of these red categories, which are non-discretionary, include $275 billion in offsetting revenue. Okay, so we get here the total is $4,447 billion. It's about $4.4 trillion in spending, and we can see that the spending is greater than the revenue. We have to also distinguish between a budget deficit, which occurs in 1 year, versus the total public debt. All right. So again, a budget deficit occurs in a given year. To finance this deficit, governments issue bonds. And what a bond is, it's a promise to pay back a set amount in the future. Okay, that set amount is given by the face value of the bond. Okay, that's the amount repaid in the future at what's called the time of maturity. All right, so the time to maturity is how far in the future the bond is repaid. How far from now do we have to wait? What are we talking about here? It may range from, say, 3 months all the way up to 30 years. These are the different categories of bonds you have in the United States federal system. Okay, the next thing is the market value. All right, the bond market is going to evaluate the government's ability to pay the bond and then discount the bond by some amount. That gives us the market value. Okay, the bond yield is then the relationship between the income from the bond and the amount that's paid for it. Okay, this will be a little clearer when we do an example. Okay, so the bond yield is given by the face value minus the market value divided by the market value and then times 100 to put it in percentage terms. Okay, so example, let's say we have a bond that has a face value of $100, right? Matures in 1 year and it has a current market value of $97. Okay, so to put this into our formula to give us the yield, we use our same formula. Okay, the face value, right, 100 minus 97 over 97. So we get 3 divided by 97. We're going to multiply that by 100 to give us 3.09%. Okay, for the bond yield in this case. And just note that the market value of the bond is not fixed. Okay, it's not always going to be 97. That's a product of the bond market. It fluctuates with changes in the bond market as the market value of bonds increases. Like, let's say it was to go from 97 to 98, the yield would be less than, right? You'd have 2 over 98. You can do the math yourself. That's less, right? The percentage is less there, okay? And vice versa. If the price of the bonds were to go down, then the yield would go up. Okay, the total of all past deficits plus financing costs, that's the bond yield, is called the total public debt. That's all of the bonds that are outstanding at any given time for the government. Okay, and again, this is different from deficits, all past accumulated deficits. Example: last year, you had a budget deficit of about $1,000 billion, about $1 trillion. But the total public debt is far, far greater than that, right? The total public debt is about $24.7 trillion. Okay, so uh, much, much larger than the deficit in one particular year. Now, we will talk about the implications of this and, is this a problem? Is this good? Is this bad? I have a separate presentation on this. All right, now we're trying to talk a little more broadly in this presentation about fiscal policy. But I will just say, in terms of the history of bonds, that governments have been issuing them for a very long time. The first bond that we know of was issued by Amsterdam in 1517, and the first bonds issued by a national government was by England in 1694 to fund the war against France at the time. Bond issues are generally associated with war, and to some extent with building infrastructure. War is the most expensive thing that governments ever do, and so they often will borrow money in the form of bonds in order to pay for the war effort. Okay, so the next question is: should the government budget be balanced? Should revenue equal expenditure? Should R equal E? Keynesians would say no. Budget deficits and surpluses are key elements of fiscal policy. They are tools. We wouldn't want to be without them, right? If revenue and expenditure was always equal, if the budget was always balanced, we wouldn't have those tools. All right, let's explore how do they work. Okay, so expansionary fiscal policy must be funded through deficit spending. That's the Keynesian playbook. All right, so let's just define this. What is this? All right, expansionary fiscal policy. These are policies of the government that are designed to increase GDP and employment during a recession, ideally reaching full employment or the potential GDP. And to do this involves one or more of the following. Okay, so we want to increase government spending on new goods and services with no taxes. All right, very, very important. Or number two, we want to cut taxes. Or number three, we want to increase transfer payments with no new taxes. This is going to produce a budget deficit. There's just no two ways around this, right? Like some of the stuff that we're doing here is going to decrease revenue, right? Other stuff that we're doing is going to increase expenditure. That's going to give us a budget deficit, and that's fine, right? That's how it's supposed to work. If we weren't able to run a deficit, we wouldn't be able to effectively do expansionary fiscal policy at all. Once the economy is growing again, then it's time for contractionary fiscal policy, okay, to pay down the total debt that was accumulated during the expansionary phase. All right, what would that look like? Well, contractionary fiscal policy is designed to, usually two ends in mind, okay, control inflation if necessary and repay the debt that was accumulated. Okay, so we would do the opposite of everything that we did so far. We would decrease government spending on new goods and services rather than increase it. We would increase taxes, and we would decrease transfer payments. And again, so we're reducing government expenditure, we're raising government revenue. And the point of all this is to then run a budget surplus, right? These are things which are going to raise revenue, decrease expenditure. It's going to produce a surplus. Keynesians argued that the government budget should be balanced cycle to cycle rather than year to year. Okay, it's not like the budget should always be balanced, but it should reach a balance over the entire business cycle. Okay, so here we have government revenue and expenditure over time, all right? And the gray areas represent periods of recession. The white represent periods of expansion, okay? So here's the way it's supposed to work, right? We in a recession, and the government is running deficits, right? We move into an expansion, and those deficits turn into surpluses. We move from expansionary fiscal policy during a recession, which produces negatives, right, in terms of the budget, deficits, and we then produce surpluses by doing contractionary. Okay, so and then if the cycle begins again, if we have another recession, again we move into negatives, then we move into surpluses. Okay, so The budget is balanced over one business cycle, okay, not in any given year, right? Look at this. Most of the time, the government budget is out of balance, right? These are deficit years, you got surplus years. That's okay, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. But it's balanced over the entirety of the cycle, okay? That is the Keynesian vision of government fiscal management of the economy. Okay, so we're going to show using the aggregate expenditure model how to uh, how to use expansionary fiscal policy to close a recessionary gap. All right. So the first thing we need to know here is what is the size of the problem, right? So look at this. We can see we are currently at 2,500, right? And we need to be at 4,000, right? That's our potential GDP. Okay, so the extent of our problem is this, right? That's the recessionary gap that we face here, 1,500. Okay, so that's how much of an effect we need to see, right? That's our delta GDP that we need to see. Okay, so the next thing is what is our aggregate expenditure function? Okay, now in this example, it's given to us, right? Now in this example, it's given to us. So in this example, it's given to us, it's AE equals 500 plus 0.8y. But if we didn't have that, we could see, okay, look, the intercept is 500. The slope of this, right, the rise over the run, 2,000 over 2,500, that would give us a slope, in this case, 0.8. All right. So what do we do next? Okay, so to understand this, we're going to use our formula. We've got delta G times the spending multiplier equals the change in GDP. All right, so remember this delta G that we're talking about, this can be any initial change in spending. Okay, it's going to be a delta I, it could be a delta G, it could be a delta C, etc. All right, the point is whatever is the initial change in spending, that's what delta G represents, we are going to have to multiply that by the spending multiplier to give us our change in GDP. All right. Now we're going to work backwards because delta G is actually the thing that we need to find, right? We want to know how big is the change in government spending that we need to produce the desired effect. All right. So we already know what the delta GDP is, right? The delta GDP in this case is 1,500. Okay, so to do this, we need the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. And that's the same as the slope of the aggregate expenditure line, the AE line. All right, and this is 0.8. We're going to use that, and we're going to plug that in to our formula for the spending multiplier. Okay, it's 1 over 1 minus the MPC. In this case, 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which is 1 over 0.2, which gives us 5. All right, so the multiplier is 5 in this example. Whatever is our initial change in spending is going to get multiplied by 5. Okay, so our recessionary gap, like I mentioned, is 1,500, and that is the size of the delta GDP that we need to see in order to bring us to full employment equilibrium, all right, to our potential GDP. So here's what we have, right, to set it up. Okay, we know what our multiplier is. Our multiplier is 5. We're going to go delta G times 5, and that equals 1,500. Okay, so all we need to do then is to solve for delta G, right? Treat it as a variable, as if it's x. Okay, so what times 5 is 1,500, and the answer is 300. Okay, what does this mean? We need a delta G of 300, and this is in billion dollars, 300 billion more dollars for the government to spend here. And let's look at the effects of that on the next slide. Okay, so what we see here is we can see there's that delta G of 300 that shifts this curve upwards, okay, by this amount, by 300. And that takes us to our potential GDP. Full employment has now been attained. We have closed that recessionary gap that we started with of 1,500, and now we're at our potential, okay, at 4,000. All right, let's look at this from the perspective of another macroeconomic model, that is the aggregate supply and demand model. And this is the orthodox Keynesian view of aggregate supply, all right? So the orthodox Keynesian view, remember, there is a flat portion of the aggregate supply curve up until we get to the potential GDP, all right, which is, in our example, is 4,000. At that point, the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical, okay? So remember this model, we have the price level on the vertical axis, and we have GDP down here on the horizontal axis, all right? What is going to be the effect here? Well, it's going to be a shift in the aggregate demand curve, right? So we're going to go from AD1, this first aggregate demand curve, to the second aggregate demand curve. We're going to shift to the right, all right? And we're going to go from our initial equilibrium point here to a new equilibrium point over here, okay? So the bottom line here is that fiscal policy has the best results in the orthodox Keynesian model. We have here a stable price level. See, we're moving along a horizontal line here, right? So no change in the price level. But what we do get is an increase in GDP, right? We go from 2,500 to 4,000, right? That would be considered the ideal results of expansionary fiscal policy. So what would things look like from the orthodox classical perspective? Remember, this is the perspective that was dominant in economic theory before Keynes. Okay, in the orthodox classical perspective, the aggregate supply curve is always vertical. There's no horizontal section, right? That's something that comes out of the argument of Keynes. So in classical economics, the equilibrium occurs at the potential GDP, right? So notice where this vertical line hits the axis is at 4,000. Potential GDP is 4,000. So the economy is, in classical economics, always at its maximum potential. That's the nature of capitalism in the classical model, right? So what would be the effect of increasing aggregate demand by this magnitude? Well, it would be to simply increase the price level, right? Now, that's not exactly the result that we're looking for, right? So the conclusion of classical economics is that the fiscal policy only is going to increase the price level. It's just going to cause inflation. It's not going to change GDP. GDP is already at its potential level. Now, in the post-World War II compromise, okay, the compromise position between the Keynesian and the classical schools, this compromise is known as the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, fancy phrase there. The effects of fiscal policy were twofold, okay? You had on the one hand increasing GDP, that's the compromise to the Keynesians, and on the other hand, you had an increase in the price level, okay? That's the compromise to the classical position. So that means that there's now a trade-off between growth and inflation that has to be reckoned with, or we're going to get both of those things, all right? Let's take a look at the graph here, okay? So here we see we're moving from our initial equilibrium point here, right, AD1, and again 2,500, to we shift this curve to the right, we get to our new equilibrium point at 4,000. So that part is similar to what we did before, right, with the orthodox Keynesian. But look at what also happens, right? We also get some increase in the price level, okay? So like I said, we get inflation, and we can even see it's 30%, right? How did I get that? Well, it's the percentage change, okay? I took the new one, 130, minus the old one, divided by the old one, all right? Gives us, and multiply by 100, that gives us 30%, okay? And we also get economic growth as well, all right? So the percentage change in GDP, we're going to take the new one, 4,000, subtract from that the old one, 2,500, divide by the old one, etc. Okay, so 60% GDP growth, 30% inflation. It's a trade-off. Now let's consider what has been the fiscal policy response to the last big recession that we had, which was the Great Recession that began in 2008. So in January 2009, President Obama is inaugurated, and there is a Democratic majority in the Congress and a very thin one in the Senate. However, the economy is entering a severe recession. So the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, that's the ARRA, was Obama's response, and it's a textbook Keynesian fiscal stimulus. It is a large increase in government spending. All right, so we can look at the different distributional effects of the ARRA. The ARRA, it was like I said, based on a liberal Keynesian philosophy. Again, the two problems of capitalism, the business cycle, and inequality. And the thinking here, tax cuts or other policies designed to raise incomes will be most effective if they're directed toward the poor or the middle class, and that will also reduce economic inequality. In practice, most of the money went to the states to prevent spending cuts in a bunch of different areas that states probably would have cut, things like healthcare, education, and there was also some money to increase infrastructure spending. Okay, so if we take a look at this distribution here, okay, the total is $787 billion, right down here. Later adjusted upwards a little bit to $831 billion. And we can see that, again, the largest portion of it, these portions here, healthcare, education, and infrastructure, these went to the states. Okay, so again, the healthcare and education were designed to shore up existing spending to prevent cuts. Okay, so now there was a portion of it which was, we could call progressive, right? That is, there was a portion of it, 82 billion, that went to low-income workers and went towards unemployment compensation, increases in unemployment compensation. All right, so $82 billion. Again, most of that directed through the states. And then a series of tax cuts. Most of them are towards individuals, some of them towards corporations. And then you had some other stuff in here as well. Okay, there was money towards energy efficiency, not a whole lot, right? Housing, some money towards science research, and some other stuff, right? So a mixture of different kinds of spending, but again, very much driven by the liberal Keynesian type of view, which is we need an injection of spending in order to stimulate the economy, and if possible, we should do at least some of it towards those in the middle or toward the bottom of the income distribution. Now, the next question is, did it work? And there's a great deal of debate over this, over the effects of the ARRA and fiscal policy in general. But the assessment of most economists is that it works in general. I mean, of course, because we have no control group, we cannot say for sure what the effects were, right? There's no way of going back and saying, well, if we hadn't done that, what would have happened? And then measuring we don't have that ability, right? We can do things, and we just don't have what the non-action case would be, right? So, like I said, most economists, following the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, are at least partly Keynesian. They believe that the ARRA was effective in lowering unemployment. We do have a number of different models that have been constructed or studies that have looked at this. One of them that's influential is from the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office. And the CBO estimated that the act had the following effects. That it would increase GDP in 2009 by between 1.4 and 3.8%, between 1.1 and 3.3% in 2010, and between 0.4 and 1.3% in 2011. Okay, so these elements are part of the effects of the stimulus, right? And then we had effects on employment as well here. Okay, so between 0.8 and 2.3 million in 2009, between 1.2 and 3.6 million in 2010, and between 0.6 and 1.9 million in 2011. And here we have a graph that was made from the Congressional Budget Office's projections. Okay, so this solid line represents what they think would have happened without the ARRA. Again, we don't really know that for sure, right? But and then versus what we think is going to happen with the ARRA, and they produce two of these. Okay, so they produce a high estimate and a low estimate. All right. So here we see, even under the best conditions, the most optimistic the high projection, right, in terms of effectiveness, we still have the economy going into a negative, right? But the point is, it's not as far negative as it would have been without the ARRA, all right? So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.